School. Did she ever go to law school?
Sadly, no.
Why not?
On August 2nd, she was murdered.
Now, let's rewind to earlier in 2012 and work our way up to her death. Who did? On August 2nd, 2012. And there are three real issues in this case that the prosecution has now proven through testimony and evidence beyond reasonable doubt. Those three issues are that Chris Everdown did in fact kill Ms. Kat Hawthorne, that he did so with intent, and that he did so after deliberation. Let's talk about the murder itself. Peter Hutchings was an eyewitness, and his testimony is clear. He saw Chris with the gun. He saw Chris aim the gun, pause, and fire, killing Ms. Hawthorne. But what's more is that the lead investigator of this homicide case confirms that this was a murder. The wound that pierced Ms. Hawthorne's heart was surgical. It would have taken an expert marksman. Who was the expert marksman? It's Mr. Everdown. Intent. Now, Peter Hutchings' testimony describes it in detail. Mr. Everdown had the gun. He aimed, paused, and fired. One does not aim, pause, and fire on accident. This was an intentional murder. Deliberation. The law does not specify how much deliberation or how far in advance the deliberation takes place. In fact, the deliberate act of aiming the gun and the few seconds he paused are deliberation enough to convict him. But that's not all the deliberation he did that day, because the defense's own witness, Ruth Lickerman, testified that Mr. Everdown was sitting in his car for hours. What was he doing? Well, Mr. Everdown himself testified that he thought his relationship with Kat was going to end. And if he couldn't have her, no one could. When Kat pulled the gun, he had his golden opportunity, and he took it and murdered Kat Hawthorne. This was not a random act either. This was part of a pattern. This was part of a pattern of an abuser, a stalker, and a murderer. Mr. Hutchings and Ms. Senna Hawthorne observed the abuse, physical, emotional, and verbal abuse that went on. Ms. Senna Hawthorne also observed the stalking tendencies, and so did Peter. He sat outside for hours at a family party. He sat outside of Ms. Kat Hawthorne's apartment complex for hours on the day of the murder. Mr. Lawrence, the lead investigator, called this a classic case of stalker murder. And then, of course, it ended in the murder. Now, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, with your verdict, you make a statement. If you return a verdict of not guilty, you are saying that a murderer can come up with a lie, a fictitious story that contradicts even his own side's witnesses, as well as an eyewitness and the lead investigator of the case, and he can walk away free. You cannot do that. You must uphold justice. And I urge you to find Chris Everdown guilty of murder in the first degree. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the only unreliable witness in this case is Chris Everdown himself. His testimony is inconsistent with everyone else's. He claims not to have abused her, but Kat Hawthorne's, the only words we have from Kat Hawthorne describe that abuse. And Kat described how she was afraid for her life. And her life was eventually taken by Chris Everdown that day. Now, Chris Everdown may have not come with a gun, but he sat in the parking lot, he deliberated, and when Kat pulled the gun, he had his opportunity. He took the gun. Now, they were in a scuffle. A step back with the gun extended could still leave gunshot residue on her. That is not a valid argument. So when he he paused and aimed. There's intent right there. The intent does not have to be conceived days, hours, in a head. It can be conceived in the moment. He did this murder intentionally. Now, they have tried to put up a smokescreen to discredit our witnesses. But Peter Hutchings described his testimony clearly, and he has no real reason to lie. Chris Everdown is here to save his own skin. Mikey Lawrence, her only obligation is to the law. and the law she has upheld today. Chris Everdell is an abuser, a stalker, a murderer. I urge you to find him guilty of murder in the first degree.